Where are you coming from?
Why does that matter?
Is this your car?
Yes, it's mine.
Show me your ID.
For what reason?
You're not leaving until I verify it.
I am a federal judge.
Stay right there.
He thought he was asserting control until he realized who he was really arresting. Officer Jack Gonzalez had been with the city police department for 11 years when he pulled into a gas station that would cost him everything he owned and destroy his career forever. He was 38 years old, experienced enough to recognize authority, arrogant enough to believe his badge outranked it. One Tuesday evening at a Shell station on Parker Boulevard, he saw a black woman in a navy blazer and gold jewelry fueling a luxury sedan and decided she had to be a fraud. The woman was Judge Teresa Dougherty, a federal judge with 14 years on the bench, jurisdiction over constitutional law, and the legal authority to overturn entire police departments. What Gonzalez did next, ignoring her federal credentials, mocking her judicial ID as a pretty good prop for a scammer, and handcuffing a sitting federal judge in her court attire, would trigger a Department of Justice investigation, a $10 million civil rights lawsuit, and a public trial that exposed 11 years of systematic targeting and abuse of power. Judge Teresa Dougherty's Tuesday began at 8:47 a.m. in the chambers of the Federal District Court, where she presided over a motion to suppress evidence in a Fourth Amendment case. The defense argued illegal search and seizure. The prosecution claimed exigent circumstances. Dougherty listened to both sides with the precision of a surgeon, asking pointed questions that revealed she had already read every filing, every precedent, every footnote. By 10:15 a.m., she had issued her ruling from the bench, a 12-minute oral decision that cited case law spanning 4 decades and left both attorneys nodding in reluctant agreement. This was her 14th year on the federal bench, and she had built a reputation for being unshakable, thorough, and utterly immune to intimidation. Across town, Officer Jack Gonzalez was finishing his 3rd cup of station coffee and complaining about his latest reprimand. He had been written up for excessive force during a traffic stop the previous month, his 4th such complaint in 3 years. His sergeant had warned him about his attitude problem, but Gonzalez dismissed it as political correctness run amok. He saw himself as a street cop who got results, someone willing to do the dirty work that bureaucrats and desk jockeys wouldn't touch. His partners had nicknamed him the Junkie Hunter because of his obsession with profiling luxury cars in certain neighborhoods, convinced that anyone who didn't fit the profile of wealth had to be dealing drugs, using stolen credit cards, or driving a stolen vehicle. While Dougherty spent her afternoon reviewing a complex civil rights lawsuit filed against a neighboring police department, Gonzalez was cruising Parker Boulevard, running plates on expensive sedans and stopping drivers for suspicious behavior. He had a theory, one he shared often in the break room. People who dressed too well or drove cars that seemed above their station were compensating for something, usually criminal activity. It didn't matter that his theory had been debunked by his own department's data. It didn't matter that his arrest rate for actual crimes was below average. What mattered to Gonzalez was the feeling of control, the moment when a driver's confidence crumbled under the weight of his authority. By 6:30 p.m., Dougherty was exhausted. She had spent 9 hours interpreting the Constitution, weighing civil liberties against government power, and ensuring that justice was applied equally under the law. She changed out of her robes, locked her chambers, and headed for her gray sedan in the courthouse parking garage. She needed gas before the drive home. It was a routine errand, unremarkable in every way. She had no reason to believe that in less than 30 minutes she would be handcuffed by a man who had spent his entire shift looking for someone exactly like her. Hit subscribe if you believe everyone should be treated fairly. Only haters and manipulators won't subscribe. Gonzalez saw the gray sedan pull into the Shell station at 7:08 p.m., and his instincts fired immediately. The car was clean, recent model, leather interior visible through the tinted windows. The driver was a black woman in business attire, moving with the kind of unhurried confidence that Gonzalez had learned to interpret as arrogance. She stepped out wearing a navy blazer, gold jewelry catching the fluorescent lights of the gas station canopy, and began fueling her vehicle without a glance in his direction. To most people, she looked like a professional heading home after work. To Gonzalez, she looked wrong. He had been parked across the street finishing paperwork when he noticed her, and something about the scene triggered his patrol reflex. The car was too nice. The jewelry was too expensive. The way she carried herself was too composed, like she owned the space around her. In his 11 years on the force, Gonzalez had developed a catalog of red flags, and this woman was checking multiple boxes. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look grateful to be safe in a well-lit area. She looked like someone who expected the world to bend around her. And that expectation, in Gonzalez's experience, usually meant she had something to hide. He pulled his cruiser into the gas station lot and positioned himself 2 pumps away, angling his vehicle so he could observe her without appearing obvious. She was scrolling through her phone while the pump ran, occasionally glancing at the digital counter. She hadn't acknowledged his presence, which Gonzalez noted as suspicious. Most people, especially people who fit her demographic, would have at least looked over when a patrol car pulled up. The fact that she didn't suggested either guilt or contempt, and both warranted further investigation. Gonzalez ran the plates through his system. The car came back clean, registered to a Teresa M. Doherty at an address in the affluent Westbrook neighborhood. No warrants, no violations, no flags, but that didn't satisfy him. People stole identities all the time. People borrowed cars from relatives or employers and pretended they belonged to them. People leased vehicles they couldn't afford and used them to project a false image of success while running scams on the side. He had seen it 100 times, and his gut told him this was one of those times. When the pump clicked off, Doherty replaced the nozzle, screwed her gas cap back on, and reached for her driver's side door. Gonzalez made his decision. He stepped out of his cruiser and called across the lot, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone used to being obeyed immediately. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the vehicle and keep your hands visible." Doherty froze, her hands still on the door handle. She turned slowly, her expression shifting from confusion to controlled irritation. Gonzalez was already walking toward her, one hand resting casually on his belt near his weapon, his body language broadcasting dominance. He had no idea that the woman standing in front of him had spent her entire day deciding whether men like him had violated the Constitution. Doherty kept her hands visible and her voice measured. She had been a federal judge long enough to know that escalation was a choice, and she refused to make it for him. "Officer, is there a problem? I'm just getting gas on my way home from work." Gonzalez stopped 3 feet away, his eyes scanning her from head to toe with undisguised suspicion. "I need to see your license and registration. This is a routine check." There was nothing routine about it, and they both knew it. Doherty reached slowly into her blazer pocket and pulled out a black leather credential case. She opened it to reveal her federal judicial identification card, complete with her photograph, the seal of the United States District Court, and her full title, Honorable Teresa M. Doherty, United States District Judge. She held it out toward Gonzalez with the calm precision of someone who had presented evidence 1,000 times. Gonzalez took the case and studied it under the gas station lights. His expression didn't change. He flipped it over, examined the back, held it up at an angle as if checking for holograms. Then he looked at Doherty with something between amusement and contempt. "This is a pretty good prop for a scammer. Where'd you get it made? Online?" Doherty felt the air shift. She had expected skepticism, maybe even a request for additional identification. She had not expected mockery. "Officer, that is my federal credentials. I'm a sitting federal judge for this district. You can verify my identity by calling the courthouse or checking the federal judiciary website. My photograph and biography are publicly available." Gonzalez handed the credentials back to her with a smirk. "Yeah, and I'm the Pope. Lady, I've seen fake IDs that look more official than this. You think you're the first person to buy a fancy card off the internet and pretend to be somebody important? I've pulled over FBI agents, Secret Service, even a guy who claimed he was a Navy admiral. You people always think a fake badge is going to get you out of trouble. Doherty's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. Officer Gonzalez, I can see your nameplate. What you are doing right now is unlawful detention without reasonable suspicion. I am providing you with valid federal identification. If you continue this stop without legal justification, you are violating my Fourth Amendment rights and exposing yourself to significant civil liability. Gonzalez stepped closer, his face hardening. Are you threatening me? Because that sounds like a threat. You know what I think? I think you stole this car, got yourself some fake credentials, and now you're trying to lawyer your way out of it. That's what I think. Doherty realized in that moment that logic would not save her. She was standing in front of a man who had already decided what she was, and no amount of evidence would change his mind. His ego had become his reality, and she was about to pay the price for it. If you can't stand power-tripping bullies like Gonzalez, comment everyone deserves respect. Trolls won't. Doherty took a slow breath and made a calculated decision. She would treat this exactly as she treated an obstinate attorney in her courtroom, with patience, precision, and an unshakable command of the law. Officer Gonzalez, I'm going to explain this once, clearly, so there is no confusion. Under Terry v. Ohio, you need reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal activity to detain me. You have not provided any such basis. Running my plates returned no violations. I have provided valid federal identification. You have no legal authority to continue this stop.
Gonzalez's face flushed. He had been challenged before, usually by defense attorneys or activists with cameras, but never with this kind of cold, clinical authority. Most people he stopped either complied immediately or became emotional, giving him the justification he needed to escalate. This woman was doing neither. She was lecturing him like he was a student who had failed an exam, and it made his blood pressure spike. Lady, I don't need a law lesson from someone with a fake ID. You're not going anywhere until I verify who you are and figure out if this car is actually yours, so you can either cooperate or I can make this a lot more difficult for you. Doherty's expression didn't change, but her tone sharpened. What you're describing is unlawful detention. If you proceed without probable cause, everything that follows will be inadmissible in court, and you will have violated my civil rights under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. That statute allows me to sue you personally for damages, not the department, you. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Gonzalez felt his authority slipping, and it triggered something primal in him. His entire career had been built on control, on being the final word in any interaction on the street. Judges lived in courtrooms, lawyers lived in offices, but out here, under these gas station lights, he was the law. And this woman, with her expensive blazer and her calm condescension, was trying to strip that away from him in front of anyone who might be watching. You think you're smarter than me? You think because you memorized some legal terms you can tell me how to do my job? I've been a cop for 11 years. I know a criminal when I see one, and right now I'm looking at one. Doherty realized she had miscalculated. She had assumed that invoking the law would force him to reconsider, that the threat of liability would restore his professionalism. Instead, she had wounded his ego, and now he was operating purely on emotion. She could see it in his posture, the way his hands kept drifting toward his belt, the tightness in his jaw. He wasn't hearing her legal arguments. He was hearing disrespect, insubordination, a challenge to his dominance. She had just given him the excuse he was looking for. Gonzalez's body cam had been recording since the moment he stepped out of his cruiser, capturing every word, every gesture, every miscalculation. What it documented would later become Exhibit A in a federal civil rights lawsuit, a 12-minute sequence that legal experts would describe as a textbook example of unlawful detention and excessive force. The footage would be played in courtrooms, analyzed in law school seminars, and referenced in police reform hearings across the country. But in that moment, under the harsh lights of the gas station, Gonzalez had no idea he was creating a permanent record of his own destruction. The camera captured Doherty standing perfectly still, her hands visible at her sides, her posture professional despite the circumstances. Her voice remained calm and steady as she cited case law, her facial expression never shifting into fear or anger. She looked exactly like what she was, a federal judge attempting to reason with someone who had no interest in reason. The contrast was devastating. Gonzalez, by comparison, was a study in escalating aggression. His body language radiated hostility. He stepped closer with each exchange, invading her personal space in a way designed to intimidate. His hand kept returning to his weapon, a subconscious gesture that broadcast threat. When Doherty cited Section 1983, the bodycam caught his face twisting into a sneer, his jaw clenching as he processed what he perceived as disrespect. He pointed at her twice during his responses, stabbing the air between them with his finger like a weapon. "Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle, now." His voice had shifted from authoritative to openly hostile, the tone of someone who had stopped pretending this was about procedure. Doherty didn't move immediately. The bodycam recorded her exact words, spoken with deliberate clarity. "Officer Gonzalez, I am a federal judge. If you place me under arrest without probable cause, you are committing a federal crime. I am asking you one final time to verify my credentials before you make a decision that will end your career." What happened next would be replayed thousands of times on news networks and social media. Gonzalez grabbed Doherty's arm and spun her toward the car with enough force that she had to catch herself against the vehicle to avoid falling. The bodycam captured the sound of her blazer scraping against the metal, the sharp intake of her breath, the dignified way she maintained her composure even as he wrenched her arms behind her back. She didn't resist, she didn't scream, she simply repeated, quietly and clearly, "This is an unlawful arrest. You are violating my federal immunity." Gonzalez wasn't listening. He pulled his handcuffs from his belt and clicked them into place, tightening them enough that Doherty winced. The bodycam recorded everything: the illegal detention, the excessive force, the moment a decorated federal judge was treated like a common criminal by a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. He had just documented his own federal crime in high definition. Only those who stand for injustice will ignore this button. Hit subscribe if you're against the abuse of power. The metallic click of the handcuffs closing around Judge Teresa Doherty's wrists was the sound of a career ending and a lawsuit beginning. It was 7:23 p.m. on a Tuesday evening at a gas station on Parker Boulevard, and Officer Jack Gonzalez had just committed what federal prosecutors would later describe as a violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. The statute carried a maximum penalty of 10 years in federal prison for willful violations. Gonzalez had no idea. He was too focused on the rush of power he felt as the cuffs tightened. Doherty stood against the sedan, her arms pulled behind her back, her blazer wrinkled from being forced against the vehicle. The handcuffs were tighter than necessary, biting into her wrists hard enough to leave marks that would be photographed and entered into evidence 48 hours later. She didn't struggle. She didn't plead. She simply stood there with the kind of stillness that comes from absolute certainty that justice, however delayed, would eventually arrive. "You're under arrest for obstruction, resisting an officer, and suspicion of identity theft," Gonzalez announced, his voice loud enough to be heard by the two other customers at the gas station who had stopped to watch. He wanted witnesses to his authority, people who would see him subdue a suspect and restore order. What he didn't realize was that those same witnesses would later testify that the woman never raised her voice, never made a threatening gesture, never did anything except ask for her rights to be respected. Gonzalez walked Doherty toward his cruiser, one hand gripping her arm with unnecessary force. She moved with dignity despite the circumstances, her head held high, her steps measured. As he opened the back door of the patrol car, she spoke one more time, her voice steady and cold.
Officer Gonzalez, you have just arrested a sitting federal judge without probable cause. Federal immunity protects me from state detention. You are now personally liable for every second of this unlawful arrest. I will see you in federal court." Gonzalez shoved her into the back seat and slammed the door. He stood there for a moment, adrenaline still flooding his system, convinced he had just made a righteous arrest. He had no idea that within 2 hours his sergeant would be screaming at him. Within 2 days, the FBI would open an investigation. And within 2 months, he would be sitting across from federal attorneys who would explain exactly how much his ego had just cost him. Sergeant Linda Ramirez had been processing bookings for 14 years, long enough that very little surprised her anymore. She had seen every kind of arrest, every type of suspect, every flavor of officer incompetence. But when Officer Jack Gonzalez walked Judge Teresa Doherty through the precinct doors in handcuffs at 7:51 p.m., Ramirez felt her stomach drop in a way that told her something catastrophic had just happened. Doherty still carried herself with perfect composure, her navy blazer now wrinkled and dusty from being pressed against the patrol car, her gold jewelry catching the fluorescent lights of the booking area. Gonzalez was walking her toward the processing desk with the swagger of someone who believed he had just made the arrest of the month. Ramirez looked at the woman's face, then at Gonzalez, then back at the woman, and felt the first cold finger of dread trace down her spine.
"Gonzalez, who do you have?" Ramirez's voice was cautious, already braced for bad news. "Identity theft suspect, fake federal ID, resisting arrest. She was driving a luxury vehicle and gave me some story about being a judge." Gonzalez was grinning, still riding the adrenaline high. Ramirez took the paperwork from his hand and glanced at the name. Teresa M. Dougherty. She looked up sharply. "Did you say federal judge?" "Yeah, that's what her fake ID claimed. Pretty elaborate scam, actually. She even had—" "Gonzalez, shut up." Ramirez's voice cut through his celebration like a blade. She was already typing the name into the database, her fingers moving faster than Gonzalez had ever seen. The screen loaded. Federal Judiciary Database. Active, United States District Judge. Appointed 2012. Current assignment, Federal District Court, Southern Division. Status, active judicial immunity. Ramirez's face went white. She looked at Dougherty, then at Gonzalez, then back at her screen as if hoping the information would change. It didn't. She had just watched a patrol officer arrest a sitting federal judge on fabricated charges, violate her federal immunity, and create a civil rights lawsuit that would bankrupt the city's insurance policy. "Gonzalez, you need to uncuff her right now, right now." Gonzalez blinked, confused by the sudden panic in Ramirez's voice. "What? Why? She's a suspect." "She's a federal judge, you idiot. A real one. You just arrested a sitting federal judge." Ramirez was already reaching for the phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the chief's direct line. It was 7:54 p.m. By 8:15 p.m., 3 attorneys from the city's legal department would be racing toward the precinct. By midnight, the mayor would be briefed. And by sunrise, Officer Jack Gonzalez would be suspended without pay pending a federal investigation. Comment, "I stand for justice," if you're not siding with the bully. Only someone with a broken moral compass would stay silent. The civil rights trial began on a cold Monday morning in February, 6 months after the gas station arrest. Judge Teresa Dougherty sat at the plaintiff's table wearing the same navy blazer she had been arrested in, a deliberate choice that her attorneys displayed in enlarged photographs throughout the courtroom. Across the aisle sat Officer Jack Gonzalez, alone except for his personal attorney, a solo practitioner he had hired with his retirement savings after the city made its position devastatingly clear. They would not defend him.
The city's legal team had reviewed the bodycam footage, consulted with their insurance carrier, and made a calculated business decision. Gonzalez had acted outside the scope of his training, ignored department protocols, and violated clearly established federal law. The Supreme Court had ruled in multiple cases that federal judges possess absolute immunity from state arrest. Gonzalez had been trained on these protections. He had signed acknowledgement forms confirming he understood judicial immunity, and then he had willfully violated every rule in the manual because his ego couldn't tolerate being corrected by a black woman in expensive jewelry.
The city settled with Judge Doherty for $3 million, issuing a public apology and implementing sweeping reforms to their training program. But Doherty's attorneys weren't finished. They pursued Gonzalez personally under Section 1983, arguing that his conduct was so egregious, so willful, and so clearly motivated by racial bias that he deserved to be held individually accountable. The jury agreed. The trial lasted 4 days. The bodycam footage was played 11 times. Witnesses testified about Gonzalez's history of targeting successful people of color, about complaints that had been filed and ignored, about a pattern of behavior that the department had enabled through indifference. Gonzalez's own testimony was a disaster. He insisted he had done nothing wrong, that he had followed his instincts, that Doherty's attitude had justified the arrest. With each answer, he confirmed exactly what the jury already believed. He had no remorse, no insight, and no business wearing a badge. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned a verdict of $7 million in compensatory damages and $3 million in punitive damages, $10 million total, personally assessed against Jack Gonzalez. His attorney requested the judgment be reduced. The judge, a colleague of Doherty's, denied the motion. Gonzalez sat motionless as the verdict was read, finally understanding that his 11-year career had been destroyed by 15 minutes of unchecked arrogance at a gas station. Judge Teresa Doherty returned to the federal bench on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the verdict. She wore a different blazer this time, charcoal gray instead of navy, but the gold jewelry remained. Her colleagues welcomed her back with quiet nods of respect, understanding that some battles leave scars even when you win. She took her seat in chambers, reviewed her docket, and prepared for oral arguments in a Fourth Amendment case. The law continued, as it always did, indifferent to the chaos that had temporarily disrupted her life.
The physical marks from the handcuffs had faded within days. The psychological impact would take longer. Doherty had spent 14 years on the bench, believing that her position afforded her a certain immunity from the kind of street-level injustice she adjudicated daily. She had been wrong. The law protected her in theory, but in practice, she had been as vulnerable as any other black woman standing at a gas station while an officer decided she didn't belong. The verdict had vindicated her legally, but it couldn't erase the memory of those handcuffs clicking shut, or the feeling of being shoved against her own car, or the humiliation of being walked through a police precinct like a criminal. Still, she returned to work. She heard cases, she issued rulings, and when defense attorneys argued that their clients' Fourth Amendment rights had been violated by overzealous police officers, she listened with a depth of understanding that could only come from lived experience. Across town, Jack Gonzalez was signing bankruptcy paperwork in a strip mall legal office. The $10 million judgment had been reduced to a structured settlement after his attorney argued that Gonzalez would never be able to pay the full amount. The final arrangement required him to surrender his home, his pension, and 75% of any future earnings for the next 20 years. He was 40 years old, unemployable in law enforcement, and facing a lifetime of financial ruin. His wife had filed for divorce 3 months after the verdict. His children barely spoke to him. He had become a cautionary tale, a name whispered in police academies as an example of what happens when ego replaces judgment. He still believed he had done nothing wrong. In interviews with local media, he insisted he had been following his training, that the system had abandoned him, that he was the real victim. No one believed him. The bodycam footage had been viewed millions of times online, dissected by legal experts and civil rights advocates who pointed to it as undeniable proof of racial profiling and abuse of power. Gonzalez had become infamous, his face associated with everything wrong with modern policing. Judge Doherty never spoke about him publicly. She didn't need to. Justice, she had learned long ago, didn't require her commentary. It simply required her presence on the bench, interpreting the law for those who came after, ensuring that the next officer who thought his badge made him untouchable would face the same reckoning Gonzalez had. If you believe no one is above the law, hit subscribe, like, and share this video. Drop a comment below. Do you think $10 million was enough for what he did?